Before we jump into today's episode, please remember this podcast is not therapy and it doesn't replace working with a qualified professional. While I aim to keep things grounded in science and offer a lot of educational insight, the content here should never be generalized. Everyone's experience is different. If you're experiencing any mental or medical distress, please reach out to a licensed provider who can support your specific needs. Welcome back to ADHD Realities, the podcast we talk all things ADHD and sexuality, even in ways that the research is still lacking. And I'm your host, Dr. Leanne Borneman. I am a clinical sexologist researcher and ADHD relationship and sexuality expert. And today's expert interview, I have my friend and colleague, Dr. Kate Balestrieri, who is an amazing powerhouse of advocacy when it comes to sexuality. We are sitting down and talking about her new book, What Happened to My Sex Life. We are getting vulnerable and creating space to just talk about all things sexuality in terms of where our sex lives go, the drive, the desire, how that changes through our lifespan, and more importantly, getting vulnerable that just because we're the experts in the room doesn't mean that we also don't experience some conflicts and disconnects. And so, without further ado, let's jump in. Today, I have the great Dr. Kate Balestrieri with me today, and we are going to definitely be talking a lot about her new book, What Happened to My Sex Life. And before we get into all the juicy, awesome conversations, please introduce yourselves to everybody.
Of course. Thanks for having me on your podcast, Leanne. As you mentioned, I'm Dr. Kate Balestrieri. I'm a licensed psychologist, a certified sex therapist, and I own a group practice called Modern Intimacy. And I did just put out a new book called What Happened to My Sex Life.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. So for those of you listening, I read this book and I resonated with it deeply. I feel like a lot of us women, married, children, the desire piece kind of falls off the side. And you don't even have to be married. You could be in a long-term relationship. You don't even have to have kids. Like I see it so much in my practice. So when I read your book, it really resonated with me. And, I'm curious, what made you feel motivated to write this book specifically right now in your life?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of a few things. One, it's a really common question that people coming to see a sex therapist are struggling with. They're often wondering, what happened to my sex life? Where did it go? What's my part in that? How do I get it back? What's going on with me? Because I think we grow up and we kind of imagine that as we are in partnership or in our adulthood, that our sex life is just going to happen naturally and easily and consistently. And what a beautiful romantic story, but just so not real.
Yeah.
And little do we know, if you don't really prioritize a relationship with your sexuality, it can become the lowest thing on your priority list. Not surprisingly, right? And sometimes maybe it needs to be a little bit lower on the priority list because other things feel more front and center. But in my own life, I think what was going on for me when I started writing this book is I just felt so disconnected, so kind of cut off from sexuality, from my own sexuality. And that was, I think, born from a few different places. The pandemic and working from home, and now suddenly living and working from home with my partner, we were seeing way too much of each other and we were way too comfortable in our sweatpants every day. So we developed some pretty unsexy habits of ordering takeout and not working out as much and watching the same kinds of shows together on TV. We just sort of became couch potatoes. And there's nothing bad or wrong with that. We love a good Netflix binge, but it started to become the main current in our relationship. And I think we stopped seeing each other sexually and ourselves sexually. So it's been a journey coming back to that, coming back to a path of eroticism together. But yeah, I definitely found myself going, what happened here? We used to be so sexual together. I'm a sexual person. What's going on that I suddenly don't care or don't prioritize it and don't even know how to reclaim it? So
Yes.
that was the genesis for this
No,
book.
that's awesome. And I think like listening to your story, and I think this is where a lot of us experts, professionals in the field, we may write books, we're helping clients, and society sees us as the experts in the room. And so sometimes it's easy to think that we're not experiencing some of these conflicts and barriers. And I feel like as a sex therapist myself, there has been more of like an internal possible shame or guilt associated with who I am sexually in compared to maybe others because this is my domain, right? This is what I do. And so what I really appreciated was your vulnerability to be honest that you, as someone who specializes in this area, are also navigating the disconnect. And so I think that's important too, that we're people regardless if we're sex therapists, we're specializing in this, and it can happen to anybody, and everyone's situation is very fluid. And
Mhm.
I liked that about your book. Like you were able to paint the fluidity of everyone's experiences by going through all the different parts and barriers that could be showing up for yourself. And I think one of the things that spoke most to me was the disconnect piece, right?
Mhm.
Like how we disconnect, where we feel disconnected. So, can you talk a little bit more about as you were writing this book and just the work that you do with your clients?
Mhm.
How does the disconnect actually come up for us? Like, what are those variables? What are we forgetting or not being in moment in time with ourselves that we get to this point?
Yeah. What happens is fairly gradual, I would say, for most folks. Certainly, for some folks, there can be a big event that happens, and then there's an immediate disconnect from their sexuality or from their body in some way. But for a lot of folks, it's really gradual and it's subtle. And you don't even realize that little by little, the relationship that you once had with your body and sensations in your body and feeling in your body starts to deteriorate. And then one day you just kind of wake up and you're kind of a talking head on top of a body. And there's a lot of um, distance between mind and body. And that integration can feel, the reintegration can feel daunting because usually we disconnect from our body when there are emotions in it or sensations in it that are uncomfortable. And everyone's impetus is a little different for the
Yeah.
flight out of body. But I think for me, I was really sitting with some grief. I was sitting with a lot of resentment. I was sitting with some burnout. And it just felt a lot easier to swim around in my brain around that instead of being back in my body because I really need a physical practice to be more embodied. And when the pandemic happened and the gyms closed, and I wasn't set up at home to be really in a movement, practice of my own.
Mhm.
I really just I evacuated my body and I didn't even realize it until all of a sudden one day I was like, oh, I don't even remember what it's like to be in my body. When did that happen? Where did I go?
Yeah.
And dropping back in took a little time because I had to be willing to feel and digest and metabolize all of the feelings that came with that reintegration.
Yeah, I mean, when you really think about it, this idea of having that moment of, wow, I'm disconnected from myself, that's just so scary. Like
Mm-hmm.
this idea of like, who am I? Where
Mm-hmm.
did the old me go? Can I recreate that person again? Is that even feasible? How do I, like, even those thoughts can be so overwhelming to then even take that step into the let's explore. And so, like, for me, I know, I'm pretty sure you mentioned it in your book, and if you didn't, I'm going to just say I talk about it a lot and I'm not going to get political here at all, but like the patriarchy and the scripts that are attached to women and vulva owners and how we're supposed to be showing up sexually. What does it look like? And I feel almost as if what I'm seeing in terms of my own experience and observations is that a lot of us in our 30s and our 40s and so on start to have that moment of like, huh, I'm disconnected. And then I asked myself, have we ever truly been connected to ourselves? Have we
Mm-hmm.
been connected to scripts? And I know you talk a little bit about that in your book in terms of like what we've been told we should or shouldn't, etc. So I don't know if you want to also point on to that topic as well and how that resonated with you, if at all.
Absolutely. I do talk a little bit about the patriarchy in my book, although I'm going to be breaking that down much more in my next book about how the patriarchy really influences sexuality in such big ways. But for sure, right, when we live in a society where there is an enforcement of two gender binary, even though we know that's not a scientific reality, um, for sex or gender. People start to feel very eclipsed in how they can be in their body, very rigid in how they can be in their body, and what that means for sexual needs and expression and creativity and expansiveness. So, for a lot of folks, that's one of the first layers of disconnection is the suppression that comes with being forced to live in such an oppressive system.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in some ways, while everything is so scary when you're realizing you're not connected to yourself anymore, it's almost like that first space for your empowerment. Like,
Mhm.
wow, this is like that moment where I get to redefine, I get to re-explore. And so when we bring it back to the concept of desire, you know, one of the things that you also brought up was burnout.
Mhm.
I would love you to touch upon burnout a little bit more. You feel free to get personal, or if you just want to talk about it more clinically in terms of your experience. But I know a lot of us use the word burnout in today's day a lot. And I don't know if people
Mhm.
know exactly what it means when they're saying it, what it looks like. Does it get to be lived on a spectrum as well? How does this show up and how do we start kind of chipping away at it to get ourselves back into feeling motivated, interested, etc. when we're talking about being with our partners and just intimacy across the board.
Of course. One of the things that I don't know if we've ever talked about this, so you may not know this about me, but I teach also at the graduate level and beyond. And one of the things that I talk about frequently with the students that I teach is how, as therapists and people in the helping professions, we have an ethical mandate to make sure that we are practicing rest and care for ourselves and rejuvenation, restoration, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're not okay, then our selves being the vehicle for the work really does a disservice to our clients. But the reality is that people in all helping fields get exhausted sometimes. It can be really hard for folks, and I say helping fields, not even professionally, but parents, people who are caring for family members, people who are caring for other people in society, right? Like when we went through the pandemic, a lot of folks experienced this burnout because they were really taxed with responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
cognitively, logistically, and then there just wasn't an opportunity for any kind of like replenishing of
Yeah.
joy, of exuberance, of happiness, of rest, of pleasure. So I think we're seeing a pretty taxing level of burnout collectively across our country, maybe even across the world, but certainly in America, where political tensions have been high
Yeah.
for the last 10 years. So, burnout can come from many sources, but basically, I conceptualize it like whenever our stress load overwhelms our resources for care and for restoration. So that again can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be relational, it can be all of those things.
Yeah, and I think what you're then bringing up is all the different layers that could go into then how are you redefining sex, intimacy? How are you feeling intrigued or interested in showing up for yourself, for your relationship sexually as well? Because like you just said, if there's relational tension and you're not discovering on better ways of breaking the conflict, why are you
Mhm.
going to want to touch sex and intimacy with a 10-foot pole? Like that then doesn't necessarily mean there's a disconnect with you, but there's just that's a conflict, and then the two could be part of the same like
Mhm.
layering effect, like an onion, like Shrek likes to say, right? Like there are multiple layers, right? Like wouldn't you agree, or
For
am I
sure.
off on this?
No, 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 for sure. Yeah, that's the thing that I hope anyone listening really takes away is that our relationship with desire is often layered. And probably the best starting point is to remove any impediments for that are blocking your desire, because usually that's the bigger problem than not knowing what you like or,
Mm,
being able to, make time or something like that. But thinking about sort of these deeper psychological layers can be really helpful in clearing up some of the cognitive residue, I'll say, that just blocks um, our connection to it.
do you think that we as a society have a lot of misconceptions around desire in terms of our experience? Because that's kind of what I've noticed in the field, just working with a lot of people. They come in, they're very unaware or disconnected from what the realities of desire can be. Do you see that as well?
We do, yeah. I think that Well, I don't think I know that we have grown up in the last however many decades in conversely one of the most sex positive moments in time, but also there's a huge bifurcation of people's experiences. And even though we have a lot more information about sex and we've defined sex positivity and there are a lot of voices really championing that and following that path, where there is a growth spurt in that direction, there's also been a growth spurt for a lot of folks advocating against sex positivity and advocating for more shame, more control,
Yeah.
more suppression of people's sexuality. And that takes a lot of shapes and forms. Sometimes it's very obvious, but often it's really covert. And the
Mm,
messaging that we hear are things like high value or low value person, language like body count. This is all a huge resurgence of sex negativity because sexuality has always been a tool of control for religions and governments
yeah.
throughout the human experience. When you can control people's sexuality, you can control their behavior because you can control how safe they feel to belong to groups. And in groups is where we get access to safety, resources, love, connection. And it becomes imperative that we belong somewhere. And so when you use sex as a weapon to make people feel afraid, it can be a very effective strategy, which is why we're seeing it.
Yeah.
Again, we're seeing this tension so loud right now between the folks shouting on the sex positivity rooftops and
Mm-hmm.
the folks shouting
Yeah.
against it.
And that makes total sense. And as you were talking about the theory, the first word that popped into my head is the concept of pleasure,
Yeah.
right? And how I know myself, even like my when I met my husband, we were in a relationship for like a year,
Mhm.
and I was in the crux of my first part of my education to becoming a certified sex therapist, and I was getting all this information and learning all these things, and that was like almost my therapy to reconnect myself. And I just sat down one day and I told him, I'm done faking my orgasms. It was like that first moment. And my husband looked at me. He's like, I knew you were faking. And I was like, why didn't you say anything? And he said, because like I wasn't sure. And it's a weird thing. And it's this idea of just like, I feel like there's so much taboo still to
Mhm.
it. And there's so much expectation attached to what pleasure should look like, what your role is around pleasure. So I know when you talk in your book about like the reclaiming pleasure part, which is very important and vital, like how does a person do this, especially when we know we're disconnected from ourselves and
Mhm.
the idea of even wanting to be intimate?
Yeah. Well, I think the first step is to believe that you are worthy of pleasure.
Mm,
Apparently, you
yeah,
don't need to earn it, right? We just need to claim it. And that's a really important step because we do live in a culture that conditions us to believe that we can rest when we've achieved XYZ. We can go on vacation and do the fun things only after we've bled ourselves dry and we're so exhausted that we can't go any further. So we have to examine the role that the internalized capitalism that most of us have in this country plays in our conditions around worthiness for pleasure. So rethinking pleasure as an inherent right is really important. Now, that does not mean we have a right to people's bodies for our
100%. Yeah.
pleasure,
Mm-hmm.
but we have a right to pleasure because everyone is capable of pleasure. And when we reclaim that inherent worthiness, then we can start to look at pleasure even as a form of activism and a form of defiance against systems that would tell us otherwise, that we're not worthy. So for me, that little oppositional journey is a fun one. And it was an important empowerment step
Yeah.
because, like many women, I've been conditioned to give of myself until there's nothing left of me. Um, and that doesn't really help me or anyone else in the long run. So, really coming back to joy and pleasure as an inherent human right is a pretty important step in beginning the process of reclaiming it. Then you get the good stuff, and that's figuring
Yeah.
out what actually brings you pleasure and doing those explorations and experiments with yourself and or with partners.
Yeah, and I think as you were talking about that, I was reflecting on myself as well as the things that you shared in your book. And when you brought up like resentment,
Mm.
I know for me, when I had my aha moment where I was like, wow, pleasure has not been centered around me. I don't want to do this
Mhm.
anymore. I had an active participant supporting me and wanting me to want the pleasure, but I also started to struggle with resentment and like frustration. Like, you don't have to go through this. You don't have to now rediscover yourself. Like, how dare you? Like, I got so angry, but I was
Mhm.
also so grateful for his support and his interest and his curiosity just as much as me. But I'm curious, when you brought up resentment, is that some of the resentment you're talking about? Because I know that that is something my clients relate to as well, is that we're here processing the empowerment. Okay, we have our stage, we get to now explore, but it's like kind of like I think the same thing with trauma work when you look back and you're like, I didn't ask for this. I
Yeah.
have to now invest all this energy, all this effort. Why me? Like, there's so much emotions that I think go through this process.
Absolutely. Resentment and anger are really, really challenging when they go unaddressed and unmetabolized because they can transition into embitterment. And all of that can get very crunchy in our bodies. It can really be a barrier and a stop for things like pleasure. And when we explore the role that resentment plays in our lives, right, it helps us explore grief. It helps us explore sadness. It helps us explore injustices. And I hear it a lot from patients that I work with about how this is just an example, but why is it that only people who have vulvas are having their reproductive rights restricted on a state by state basis,
Yeah.
and people with penises have rights across all 50 states in this country? Nothing restricts their reproductive health care. And that's a huge injustice. And if you're someone who has a vulva, I'm 99% sure that you've stopped to think about of what that means for you and how you're
Mhm.
affected, if you're affected, and how other people with vulvas are affected. And um, there are certainly a lot of other things going on right now politically that are creating for people awareness of even more injustices that exist. And even though some of that might not be directly related to folks' sexuality, it affects how they feel in the world. And if we don't feel safe, sex may not be available. It may not be interesting. And there's a lot of resentment that can come up with saying, well, why do those people over there get to have all these rights and all these privileges, and these people over here don't? And if you're someone who cares beyond the tip of your own nose, you're going to feel that way sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I think we're seeing a collective uprising of women getting in touch with that rage, and other groups, of course, also getting in touch with that rage in a way that hopefully will be really productive in
Hmm.
reclaiming rights and
Yeah.
privileges.
That
But
could be only hope.
the hope, yeah, we hope. But certainly, we can have advocacy in small moments with ourselves behind closed doors, and also on the bigger political stages. So every step of advocacy counts.
Yeah. And I obviously, you're on right now my podcast and I center towards an ADHD community. And as we're
Mhm.
talking about this, it's important information. And then I think that extra piece, that ADHD lens piece of how a
Mhm.
lot of us have more sensitivities due
Mhm.
to our dysregulation and our emotions. And so I know for me, when I went through this process, the dysregulation, I think, created a further weighted barrier for me in my relationship as I was exploring desire and what it meant for me to have my pleasure and what sexuality meant to me. And I'm still discovering it, but I
Mhm.
do believe that there is that extra level. And so when you also bring in the burnout piece, I also know that there is another side for ADHDers of ADHD burnout, right? It's not just burnout from having stress upon stress upon stress and not giving yourself time to space, breathe, relax time. But then on top of that, the masking that shows up trying to be something, right? But I like to remind people, isn't that very similar though? How a lot of us women and vulva owners have been operating a lot of our lives where we're trying to show up and be something we've been told we have to be to push through. And we have this aha moment. And it's like, what do we do with it? So I just wanted to add that extra piece because I know, like, for my listeners, sometimes it's a lot harder for us. Not saying it across the board, but I know that dysregulation piece can make it so much more weighted for us for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And for people who will eventually go through menopause, that's a real
Yep.
treat I'm saying that facetiously, of
I
course.
know. I'm perimenopause right now, so I already have started. I got the welcoming to it, so it's been great. That's sarcasm.
I'm right there with you. And man, it is, it's an interesting mix of liberation and also like debilitation some
Yeah.
days. But for a lot of folks with ADHD, whether they're aware of it or not, whether they even have had the diagnosis or the suspicion of their ADHD before perimenopause really, wow, does it exacerbate any ADHD symptoms in such a big way because there's no longer the fucks to give around the
Yep.
masking.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's liberating, but also it's
Very
hard.
overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's another reason why a lot of us women and vulva owners are more so late diagnosed, amongst other things, usually like in our mid 30s, early
Mhm.
40s, because our symptoms are getting worse because of perimenopause. And that's that prime age for a lot of us to start welcoming into that new chapter of our lives.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be a real adjustment.
Yeah. So, I mean, so, okay. Going back to burnout, because I do believe that that's a very common thing for a lot of us, especially because we're talking about all these different layers to our experiences and what could be added to it. We live in a society where it's just go, 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 go. And if we know burnout is something that is being created because we're just go, go, going, how do we
Mhm.
find the time? Right? How do we find the time not just to decompress for ourselves, but then show up sexually? What would you suggest? How do we approach this when we're in this constant go, go, go mode? Or maybe we have trauma in our past that's also causing us to just want to go, 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 go instead of take a second and pause.
Right. Well, I think the path is different for everyone. And that's kind of a cop-out answer, but I do want to leave a little room for everyone to find a path and curate a path that really makes sense for them because there really isn't a one-size-fits-all return
Fair.
to desire. So it would feel careless to suggest one path. But I will say that in the book, I talk about two things that can be a good start for people. Because most of the time, especially when we're talking about burnout as a predicating factor for decreased desire, what comes up for people is, oh God, I have to do one more thing. Oh, now I have to make this lifestyle. Oh my gosh, I don't have the
Mhm.
bandwidth for that, right? So that's really a huge obstacle for people who are trying to course shift in their return to desire because it feels like if I don't have time or the bandwidth to do the big things that I need to do, quote unquote, need to do, how am I ever going to get there?
Yeah.
So I like to recommend really, really small, digestible shifts that you can do throughout your day that are not overwhelming, that don't require a ton of bandwidth. So it might be something simple as throwing a yoga mat down somewhere between your bedroom and your kitchen so that you see it
Mhm.
and remember to step on it and maybe do like a minute of stretching. And
Mm.
just that 1 minute of stretching or breathing into a certain part of your body each day, just take a minute. If all you have is 1 minute, just take that minute and just notice something happening in your body. And if you can do that maybe once, maybe twice a day, that's a step, right?
Yeah.
And maybe after a week or 2 weeks, you might be just noticing your body in different ways. And okay, well, now you've started to drop back in and there's some integration happening, and it didn't really cost a lot of bandwidth. So
Yeah.
that's one thing you can do. Or maybe creating some mindful eating or mindful walking strategies. We have to walk somewhere, even if it's from the couch to the bathroom. So when you're walking, can you be very conscious of right foot, left foot, my arms are swinging. Okay, I like the way the breeze feels on my arms. Okay, and that's it. These are small little moments of reintegration with yourself and your
Mhm.
senses that can start to set the stage for pleasure and joy to be more accessible, also in small moments.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, I would be feeling safe to say is that, we always think of a goal, right? So if we know that we're disconnected from ourselves and we're having desire concerns, the goal is to not have them. So this idea of even being more mindful and aware of your body as you're walking to the bathroom might sound so stupid, or might not even, you might not even think of that, because that's a weird thing to even think of as part of the process. But that in itself, I think, makes you feel less pressure. And that, believe it or not, that's actually very ADHD friendly, as you were saying that. And I liked the idea of the yoga mat. And I'm actually going to try that, because I used to do Pilates and I love stretching. But even if, like, let's say you throw your yoga mat somewhere and you pass it 4 times, and on the fifth time you finally have the mental space to do it, or let's say your impulsivity didn't allow it for that moment in time, but now you did, at least you showed up. And because you know that there's nothing more than just showing up maybe for 30 seconds, a minute, it's like, okay, I can do it. And I think that's really important for people listening right now, because it's like the staircase. I say to my clients, like what you just talked about is part of one of the steps, right?
Mm-hmm.
To getting to where you want to go and to breaking it apart so it doesn't feel so freaking overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean that's really, I think, the hardest thing is we sort of look at the path back to desire as this giant uphill strategy, and look, it can be
Yeah.
sometimes, right? It can feel like a Sisyphean endeavor. You're just pushing that rock and whew, not getting very far. But really, if you move in small increments, if you maybe take a week and just focus on one sense.
Yeah.
So for this week, maybe just focus on smelling things, and people might be like, what? That's so weird. And I get it. It might feel strange because we don't give a lot of attention to our senses. But notice, like, when you drink your matcha in the morning or your coffee, or when you take the towels out of the dryer, just take an extra inhale of, like, let me notice this, and just
Mhm.
notice what it's like to like absorb and relish that smell, or smell something and go, oh, yuck,
Yeah.
ugh,
Uh-huh.
that's whatever the reality of the smell is. Just be present with it. And maybe next week you focus on touch, or the following week taste. I mean, you can organize a return to your body in a way that makes sense for you and whatever feels interesting. But just these little things over time, it really does push the rock uphill.
And I like how you also just mentioned senses, not just in the things that you enjoy, but also the things that you don't. Because it made me think of how, like, when we are having sex, for anyone listening, really ask yourself, when was the last time you were truly in it mentally? You were taking that moment. And if you're showing up because you feel it's your job or it's a duty or what have you, or you don't really have a connection with yourself, how connected are you in the experience? So showing up even to paying attention to things you don't like can be so helpful, because then you have that space to talk about it and you're now more connected to yourself. So I love that you brought that up, because I think a lot of people think that when we're talking about mindfulness experiences and being more connected to ourselves, it should only be about the things that make us happy or bring us joy. No, there's the other side that's just as important.
It's just as important. Yes, this is a connection that I try to make clear in the book. When we are more engaged with our senses and with our body, it is wildly important information that helps us understand what our yeses are, but also what our nos are. And that's really key, because especially for a lot of vulva owners who are in um, heterosexual relationships, there's a lot of pressure to be sexual for your partner. And I know a lot of the guys that I work with will be like, no, 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 I never want my partner to do sex or have sex from a place of obligation. And that's lovely. But societally, there's still a lot of pressure on women to sort of have an experience of sex for their partner's pleasure. And what can happen then is they aren't as keyed into what their no is. And then because they're not keyed into that, they are experiencing things that are uncomfortable or that are undesirable during sex. And then their chasm widens between desire and lack of desire, right? So
Yeah.
why would you want to keep having sex that isn't pleasurable? You
Yeah.
wouldn't, of
No.
course not.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't know what your no is, guess what? You're going to be tolerating a lot more stuff that isn't pleasurable.
Yeah, and even to go back, like, I've met a lot of, because I work solely with heterosexual couples, not because I choose, I just seem to attract heterosexual couples. I've talked to some colleagues and they also attract, and they don't know why, but
Mm.
that's the clientele I serve. And I've noticed a lot of men coming in and saying things similar, like, I don't ever want to force my partner to do this, this, and that. But what they don't recognize and realize is that we're coming in here in this space because you know that your partner isn't having sex with you and you
Yeah.
want that. And instead of the narrative of, I would love my partner to be so empowered and want to play and engage, the narrative tends to be, I just want my partner to have sex again. And
Mhm.
that is unfortunately very one-sided. And I like to remind people that I don't think all men are assholes by any mean. And I think a lot of the clients I work with, they've been given that same script. A lot of the women I work with have, and kind of they're like the victim of the scripthood, if you will. And so they don't even realize even just the engagement and the need to reach out to a therapist in this area is still very centered on your pleasure, not hers. And that pressure is there and that shame is there.
Yeah, yeah. And that centering of his experience. Like, I think you're right. Men are deeply conditioned by patriarchy
Mm-hmm.
in ways that complement, I don't mean complement in a positive way, but complement in sort of a
Yeah.
symbiotic way, the ways that women are conditioned in a patriarchy. And a lot of men don't really realize just how conditioned they are to sort of center their own pleasure, center their own experience. So even when they want their female partner to have pleasure, it's often so that they can feel good about themselves as partners or lovers. And it's less about what she's experienced and more about, I want her to experience that so I can feel
Yeah.
permission to have the desire that I have.
Yeah. And
Right.
because, like you just said, the conditioning piece,
Yeah.
this is where I think a lot of people become further disconnected because then they see their partner as an asshole or
Right.
selfish. And in reality, I think two can be on the same stage. You can be conditioned and still care, but not know how to approach care in a way that actually is showing up for both of you instead of just one of you.
For sure, for sure. And I think a lot of men have been conditioned to see connection through sex,
Yeah,
whereas
that's
a
a
lot
good
of,
point.
yeah, whereas a lot of women seek connection before they feel sexual. Now, that's obviously, these are blanket
Yeah.
generalizations, and there are always people who are not, that don't fit that description. And there's often a relation, there are many relationships where a female partner has the higher desire than the male partner. So, again, these are not rigid scripts, but for a lot of folks, there's some resonance here.
Yeah. And I think all of that goes to another piece because it's usually like when I'm working with people, it's I love my partner. You know,
Mhm.
I love my partner, but I just don't want, or I, it's just too much, or, and then there's that shame piece that I think comes up. You know, can you speak on that? Because I think there could be a lot going on beneath the surface there for a person and for people listening. I would love the relatableness, if you will, to that experience. I know a lot of us have that. I know I had that. Like, I love my partner. I would love to, but, you know,
But what? But you're not feeling it?
but that's the thing. Like, what's stopping me, right? Like, what
Mhm.
is stopping me? And I'm curious to know from your perspective. I'm well aware that it's not just one thing, right? And that's the frustrating part about, I think, any of this, that we wish it was just one thing. You know, from you and your experience in writing this book, what are some of those common themes? I know we kind of been touching upon them, but maybe naming them word for word would be really great.
Well, one of the things that is maybe not talked about enough when we're talking about desire discrepancies is the sexual emotional labor that comes with creating a bridge between the discrepancy, between the partners
Mm.
around the discrepancy. And both partners, the higher desire partner and the lower desire partner, have to do some emotional labor to kind of get to a place where they can meet each other. But that labor might be a little different. And for both partners, there can be a lot of shame, right? The higher desire partner might feel like, wow, gosh, I really, something's quote unquote wrong with me that I have so much desire. I just need so much sex. What's going on there? Why can I not be satisfied with the amount of sex my partner wants or needs? Sometimes it gets internalized that way. Sometimes it's like, wow, I really want to be sexual with my partner and I don't want to keep pushing them. I don't want to keep burdening them with them. I'm a lot. I'm too much. I hear those things a lot. The lower desire partner often sounds like, I really want my partner to have a sexually fulfilled life, and I'm just not interested as much as they are in sex, or um, I have XYZ going on in my world that makes it hard for me to connect with desire. But What can happen is when couples are not on the same side of the problem and they locate the problem in each other, which often happens, then they start to really feel like, wow, I'm doing a lot here to please my partner, either in the form of depriving myself of sexuality so that my partner is unburdened by my higher desire, or having sex when I don't want to have sex so my partner isn't deprived of sexuality for the lower desire partner. Now, herein lies part of the difficulty that comes up in relationships for people, where we kind of expect, in monogamous relationships anyway, to get these needs met with a partner. And sometimes there can be some entitlement that comes along with that,
Mm,
which really can further complicate the desire discrepancy. Because if you think it's your partner's duty to satisfy your sexual needs, you might be a little less gracious about what's going on between the two of you. And
yeah.
here's where there can be a lot of emotional labor then that goes into preventing blowups or preventing stress or discontent. And people can consciously or unconsciously weaponize their feelings to coerce an outcome. And
Hmm.
that just exacerbates the desire discrepancy, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, and I think also that emotional piece, I think we always think so much more physical, like what's
Mhm.
going on, and pleasure obviously is still emotional, but uh, it takes two to tango, and there's a lot going on there for a lot of people. Um, And so I think you bring up some very valuable points for people to think of, because I always think like these types of conversations, it's not like you said, it's not a one size fits all. It's more about like a sprinkle of help, I like to say. And in some capacity, going to this idea of sprinkles, what's been running through my head, I'm a very visual person. As we've been talking about this, this idea of, and then you get to really explore the more fun stuff, or what do you like, what don't you like? It's almost like baking a freaking cake, right? You
Mm,
have to get all of the actual ingredients. The ingredients are all the different layers. You have to mix it together. You have to bake it. And
mhm,
then it's okay, we have a structure here, we have a foundation. And now let's start decorating. Let's start
mhm,
putting the things on top. And I think people just automatically latch on. And I don't mean to speak generalizably. I'm sure that there's other people that don't, but they latch on to like the tools of spicing it up, right? Getting the cards, doing this, doing that. And in reality, I think what you're really talking about at the heart of it is that we really have to do some deep work. We have to really look inward here.
Yeah. Look, sometimes it's an easy fix, like getting some sexy lingerie or a new sex toy or watching a video that's erotic together. Sometimes it is that simple, but often it's not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so here's my question for you, because
Mhm.
again, not a one size fits all. For those of us struggling with pleasure, showing up, feeling comfortable, confident, what do you think is one small way? And I know you gave the example of the yoga mat, so that might be just it. But what's one small way we can start reconnecting to our desire, that may not shut us down?
Mm.
I'm sorry if you can hear the lawnmower thing in the background.
Oh, it's very faint.
Okay, okay, good.
What is one thing people can start to do to reclaim their desire? Um, I would say maybe identify what you believe to be the biggest barrier and start working on eradicating that or making some adjustments to that. So, if it's a question of, I'm always so tired, right? And I think the fact that I'm so tired all the time is why I have no desire. Okay, great. Then let's work on getting more rest. What are
Mm,
the things that are getting in the way of your rest? Are you in perimenopause and you're waking up at 3 a.m. every night because thanks, perimenopause? Or are you a parent who's got two young ones and you just don't have enough energy no matter how much you get to sleep? Are you someone who's working 80 hours a week and you don't have the ability to actually restore your body? What's going on there? Are you taking on more of the domestic labor than your partner is? And do the two of you need to have a recalibration moment, right? What can you let go of? What can you make space for to start getting better sleep or more sleep, right? So I would say those are like the little tangible
yeah.
things, the bite-sized things that, doing all the stuff at once feels really overwhelming. But if all you're focusing on is maybe do I just need to like change my pillow so I can get a better night's sleep. Okay, let me start there and see what happens.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really great advice because what you're saying is you're zoning in on what you are identifying at least as the problem. And then that's kind of the top of the staircase. And now we're figuring out unpacking it. What does it look like? How do you
Mhm.
approach it? Can you approach it alone? Do you need to go see a qualified professional to help? Is this something that is more of a barrier because maybe your partner is struggling to show up vulnerability wise that's needed for that type of dynamic? I really, really like that feedback. I think that's a very
Mhm.
helpful way to approach it because, again, I think what's most important is that it's not a one size fits all and it is a process. And for some people, it can be easy. For other people, it's very hard. And it's finding where are you on that spectrum and
Mhm.
how do you get there? And so I'm curious too, and I'm kind of putting the attention back on you,
Okay.
writing this book, because I'm writing my own book right now. And I know there's a lot of hardship going into it. I'm
Right.
curious because this is a personal piece for you. What would
Mhm.
you say was the hardest part of writing this book for you as a professional, as a person, all encompassing?
Yeah, there were several things that made writing this book both exciting and challenging. One of which, probably the biggest factor, is that I really had to get real about what was going on between my partner and I. And look, I can intellectualize it. I could give you the long bullet point list of all the things I thought we needed to work on and do, but really feeling the grief and the anger and the frustration in that space just felt really real when I was writing the book and talking with my partner about what was coming up for me in the process. And the second thing that was challenging about the book is that I didn't have a tidy ending. Right. When I finished writing this book, wasn't like my partner and I were swinging from the chandeliers, having all this great sex. We weren't.
Yeah.
Um, it's a process, and it is a layered process of reclaiming our sexuality, my sexuality for me, but ours together. And we've definitely made some great strides and have prioritized it differently, and that feels really healing and cathartic. But I couldn't like put a bow on it and just be like, and here's your happy ending, readers, because guess what? It just takes time, and it's not a fixed finish line, right? As we evolve and continue to have life and have milestones in life, I suspect there will be more oscillations in desire. And probably the thing that is the most frustrating, but also the most human, is that partners often have a different sense of urgency to address this problem and a different approach to addressing it.
Yes.
And and that sort of difference in urgency can sometimes add to the chasm of
Mm.
discrepancy between desire. And for me, I'm the higher desire partner in my partnership. And I was like, come on, let's do it. Let's figure it out. Let's get the solution. And my partner was like, yeah, yes, let's do it. But also, do we have to do it in this moment?
I
Right?
relate to that with my impulsivity. The second I have something, I'm like, let's go. And my husband's like, pause, please
Yeah.
pause. Yeah. Yeah. And I can definitely see how that was hard for you because I think that goes back to the expectations, even just as so much as when we're talking about therapy and desire and anything sexuality, like, okay, we're reading the resource, we're looking at the tool. Okay, I'll be good now. When 9 times out of 10, that's not how it works. And I think that that is very vulnerable of you that not only did you lean into writing a book that was very important for a lot of people, but you did it by being open to your experiences. And it was almost probably like a little bit of a therapeutic process. Because I know for me, when I was doing the research for my dissertation, I dealt with that anger, that frustration, because I wasn't seeing myself in the literature. And it was
Mm.
almost as if I was grieving too, because I wasn't being seen and heard. So I can only imagine how you writing a book for others, right? That also is about you in some capacity and not being able to say, I did the thing and I'm good now.
Yeah. Well, Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. It was definitely a choice to self-disclose, but it was a choice that I made very intentionally because I'm sure you get this too in the work that you do. It's often couples or people will come in and they assume like, oh, well, you've got it all figured out. You can't possibly know what I'm going through. I'm sure your sex life is fine, right? People love to imagine that sex therapists just have these wildly, thriving sex lives. And look, many do.
Yeah.
And also, those same therapists have probably had dips and they've had stalls and they've had reimaginings. And that is part of the human experience, whether you're a sex therapist or not, because desire is dynamic. It's changing. We are dynamic as beings. We are always growing and evolving and shifting if we give ourselves permission to do that. And sometimes even when we don't give ourselves
Yeah.
permission to do that. So it's to be expected that our relationship with desire and sexuality is going to look different at different points of our lives. And I really wanted to normalize that because also you don't have to have sex 8 times a week in order to have a thriving sex life. We get to define what that means for us based on where we are and who we are on our life journey. And in this chapter, it might mean this, and in that chapter, it might look like something else. So I really want readers to remember that they get to determine like what is important to them and how they prioritize that. And if sex is something you're okay with being on the back burner right now, great, then do that. Keep it on the back burner. It'll be there when you come back for
That was a really awesome way to close out this conversation because that was quite kick-ass empowering.
it.
I
You.
really, really appreciated that. Now, for people who are listening today and maybe they want to look more at your work, find your book, how can people find you?
My website is probably the best place to start. So modernintimacy.com, and you can get a sense of where my team and I practice and what our areas of focus are. And on TikTok, Instagram, and Threads, you can find me at Dr. Kate Balestrieri. On YouTube, it's at Modern Intimacy. And you can check out my podcast, Get Naked with Dr. Kate.
Awesome, awesome. And I'll put all of that in the description for everyone below. Dr. Kate Balestrieri, thank you so much for spending the time today. I really wholeheartedly enjoyed this conversation. It hit home more than you may know. So thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Huge thanks to Dr. Kate Balestrieri for bringing not only honesty, but the nuance associated with desire. While today's episode was not specific to a neurodivergence experience, desire itself is something we all will and can experience. And while ADHD might provide different layers, which I go into more on my separate research and the new book that I'm writing, Dr. Kate Balestrieri brings her expertise in helping us better understand it and the nuances surrounding it. So today's episode, if it hit, if it resonated, please share it with a friend, your partner, your therapist, maybe all three. And if you're interested in finding out more about Dr. Kate Balestrieri, the work that she does, please go to all links down below in the description. And as always, thank you so much for joining in today, and I hope it resonated, it helped, and it empowered. And until next time, everyone, be well.